Today I'm talking to ThreatQuotient. I've got John Czupak, who's president and CEO, and Ryan Trost, who's CTO and co-founder. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, John, why don't we start out with you and give us a high level of ThreatQuotient, value proposition, what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. First of all, thanks for having us today. ThreatQuotient is a threat intelligence company. That's a bit of an overused phrase these days in the industry. But more specifically, what we have developed is what's described as a threat intelligence platform. So if you think of an analyst or a user that has the need to take threat intelligence information, to make use of that information in a way to investigate breaches, incidents, actors, campaigns, we provide a platform that allows for the ingestion of that information. We provide analytics on top of that, and I think that what I like to describe as the third leg of the stool, we provide certain levels of orchestration of that information into the sensor grid. So what is a sensor grid? Things like IDS systems, IPS systems, firewalls, endpoint systems. So specifically, we're a provider of a threat intelligence platform.
Yeah, I like to think of it as, to me it's another form of business intelligence. It just happens to be this threat data, usually coming in the form of streams and feeds. And I think of it as big hourglass, because you got a lot of feeds, you got one knowledge platform to enrich and filter, and then you've got all the tools that need to understand what they need to do next.
Yeah, and as an old sales guy, I always like to go back to kind of the problem that we talk to as well, the problem that we solve. So if you think of a security operations center, a SOC, and some of the problems that they face in trying to ingest this, their reality is they use lots of sources of this information. They may be public feeds, private feeds, open source, shared feeds. The practical reality is these operators who are high-paid individuals spend a lot of their time creating their own systems to try to manage this information, to ingest it. So they're creating spreadsheets and databases and their own homegrown collaboration capabilities, right? And so that's really inefficient. There's a cost to that, but I think what's more important is when they handle situations in that way, the time to detection is a problem. So what we do is we solve the problem of automating a lot of that process for them.
Ryan, what kind of data do you look at? Does it come in all forms and you've got to really manipulate it?
It does come in all forms. All the providers provided in, whether it's XML or JSON file formats. So our goal is to ingest that automatically and then kind of normalize it and standardize it. So is the IP address got the proper number of octets? MD5 hash has 32 characters. Making sure before we push it out to the detection tools that it's in the proper format. And a lot of the sharing is kind of, they neuter the indicators. So www.badguy.bracket.com, but you can't push that in that format out to the different sensor grids and so forth. So we've got to kind of refang and then push it out to the sensors for blocking and tackling.
Does every customer end up coming up with some new unique source that they want to include?
They do. A lot of them have small kind of private communities where they are sharing a little bit more. So there is a level of what exactly does that feed look like, or providing the customers that capability to build that feed themselves within the tool.
Walk me through the typical discovery of a problem, an incident, and how they use your tool to help them understand what happened.
The workflow, so ThreatQ ultimately ingests a lot of that threat intelligence. And what we do is we do that normalization, standardization. We push it out to the different sensor grids, the firewalls and IDSs, as John was mentioning earlier. That alert is going to go up to the SIM. And what we do is we provide that context into the SIM environment so that when that alert hits, the analyst who has to triage that alert sees a wealth of knowledge. So they have a better idea of what actions they have to take, what logs they have to kind of pull and look at so that their triage of the investigation is significantly faster versus historically they would look at that alert, look at the IP address associated to that alert, and then they'd have to jump into a bunch of different web browsers and then try to look at all the different websites that they're gleaning information from and try to consolidate it down into kind of one uniform process.
John, you were right in that threat intelligence is not necessarily overused term, it's just being used a lot to describe a lot of things. And I think I'm tracking close to 40 companies that self-identify as in the threat intelligence space. How do we differentiate? How does a buyer figure out what they need first and then who to talk to?
Yeah, so when I describe the market, I describe it in a couple of different ways, right? And so the first way I look at this, and sometimes I have to do it this way for folks that are either confused or they don't understand, or perhaps are not cyber folks, so we deal with that oftentimes. And so I like to characterize the industry as this kind of notion of you've got historically prevention technologies, you've got detection technologies, and you have this, oops, we just got owned piece of the market. Call it forensics, call it remediation, call it incident response, but there's a whole bucket of stuff there, right? And I put threat intelligence into that third bucket. So as a business, what's particularly interesting about this is there's a wave of attention, focus, investment, and budgets starting to occur in threat intelligence. Now, as we start to talk about that bucket, there are additional layers to that. I called out forensics, threat intelligence as a space. Folks are doing things like creating automated orchestration of incident response, and there's a lot of stuff going on. The way I describe threat intelligence is it's maybe not academically precise, but I think it helps frame the industry a little bit in a way that's understandable. And so I view it in two simple buckets. One is the threat intelligence content developers or providers. These are organizations that have research team, they create content, they sell that content to organizations. That's where the industry, I think, grew up, from that cast of companies, and I could name any number of companies that are in that space. The second piece is this thing called a threat intelligence platform, which I referred to earlier. And a threat intelligence platform, or a TIP, which, by the way, has been already described by Gartner, so I'm not creating this industry terminology. This is the orchestration engine for all of these disparate sources, right? And so, I don't necessarily claim that threat intelligence is all of those pieces, but we view the market in those two components. And so what I like about what we do is we solve a really well understood problem. I don't have to have an evangelical conversation about why what I do matters. When we have the opportunity to put our technology in front of customers, they get it. They understand the pain and the problem. So that's particularly interesting. And I think the second piece, which is compelling about what we do, is I theorize that while there are many suppliers of threat intelligence, and organizations have their own threat intelligence that they need to be able to integrate with their environment, everybody that has a need for this intelligence will have a need for a TIP. Everybody will at least have that problem. So it's a really interesting space for us to be in.
Yeah. So Ryan, one of the other interesting spaces that I love to follow is the resurgence of honeypots, commercial honeypots as a product. And it occurred to me that they are generating threat intelligence, right? They're creating IOCs and hashes of files and botnet IP addresses. So if that's a source of internal threat feed, are you seeing opportunities to partner with them and incorporate their data as well?
Yes, and it's very cyclical because it's kind of full circle. So the threat intelligence can provide information to the honeypot, because that's ultimately what the attacker wants to kind of entice and to lure them away from the crown jewels. But you're absolutely right. That full circle, providing that information back into the threat intelligence, the indicators, the TTPs, what files were they looking for, what actions did the adversary take within the honeypot, is critical information for that internal team to take action on.
Cool. And John, we've had, I think, 2 pretty major acquisitions just in the last 3 months, and a couple of big financings too. Do you see anything slowing down in the future?
No, I don't think so. I think we're at the beginning stages. So again, the way I view this, the market and the opportunity, I believe we're at the very beginning stages of what's happening in this part of the industry. But we're not so early that there isn't money being spent, there aren't budgets being created, there aren't RFPs being issued. This is not something that's coming 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road. It's happening right now. So if you ascribe or believe the statistics that we read, I actually do believe it because I'm kind of anecdotally seeing it. The consumers of a tip right now, that market space is the penetration of that is very, very low today. The projections are over the next several years that there's going to be a high penetration, more than 50% penetration of that market space in the next 3 years. So if you believe that, the inference is there will be a lot of purchasing, deployment happening over the next 3 years. And so I read actually kind of 2 possible themes in your question, and maybe I'm taking it in a direction that you didn't intend. But one is where is the market and where is that heading? But the other is this notion of activity, mergers and acquisitions, funding. Right. And I think there's a high interest in funding still, even though the markets are contracting. Part of the problem with the traditional sources is when they hear threat intelligence, they scratch their head. Because they literally say, I talked to 50 of these last week, right? So there will be a challenge for quality companies to rise above the noise. I like where we're at. We have really top-tier partner in NEA, which backed us. We closed our financing in December of this year. Do I believe, you didn't ask this, but I'll perhaps step ahead of the question a little bit. Do I believe there will be continued M&A in this space? I absolutely do, because it's a unique problem set that requires focused talent and domain knowledge. And there are very big quality companies that could go do this, but it's the age-old, do they have the appetite to do it and the time to be able to create these things? So, you know, I would guess you would continue to see activity in this space on the business side.
The other threat I see, it's two-way. When I see what threat intelligence platforms do, I see, you know, immediate value, right? So the people who are trying to do the forensics and stop things in their tracks are going to get that value out of the threat intelligence platform. And a lot of threat intelligence platforms view themselves as just enriching what the SIM is telling people. In other words, SIM gets to be the pane of glass everybody looks at, and the SIM highlights things that the threat intelligence platform tells them are important. But it could go the other way, and the SIM could eventually not be an important, you know, focus of the SOC, and the threat intelligence platform could be. In other words, I'm excited about TIPs, as we're calling them, because they could finally do what the SIM always promised it was doing.
Yeah, so by way of background, I was with a small SIM company I sold many years ago, so I lived this world. This was sort of before any of the big guys had established themselves as a leader. And in those days, there was the big promise and the big letdown over the years. So people spent a lot of money in SIMs and they never quite delivered what the promise was. But despite that, organizations still use them. It is the pane of glass for a lot of organizations. I actually agree with you on the point that the tip has the possibility, the potential, to be the center of the operations. It has the possibility to be the pane of glass that people use. And I think the way you get there actually is by creating use cases on the platform where you have multiple individuals within the SOC that get value from that platform. And that could be in a number of ways. You provide new functionality, you provide really creative training capabilities so that you go up and down the stack of users. But if I have in a SOC a junior analyst using it alongside a senior analyst, and my malware hunter is using it, and my IR guy is using it, it gets embedded and becomes that single pane of glass. As a product in an industry, we're not there yet, but that potential actually exists. I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
And to touch upon that, in a previous life, I ran the Security Operations Center for General Dynamics, and that's exactly what we saw. Is the security analysts were traditionally in front of the SIM. That was ultimately their role of responsibility. But the intelligence analysts, the malware hunter, the vulnerability assessment SME, they didn't play in the SIM all that much. They had their own tools. whereas a lot of the tips have little functionalities across each of the disciplines because its purpose is to collaborate. I mean, obviously the sweet spot is the aggregation, normalization, and standardization of indicator management, but it's also that you have these analysts shoulder to shoulder, but yet they don't collaborate across all of their tools. Whereas a tip, you have that capability, you have a little bit of everything. So a lot of the analysts start to make that their primary focus. Not to say it'll be any time in the near future, but I see it definitely is a great kind of capability and potential.
Yeah, it's got that potential. So on another vein, I was talking to Andy Osmond over at DHS, and right when he was saying, hey, we're finally finished with our own ability to integrate threat intelligence sharing with inside DHS, and we're going to expose it to the world for free to anybody who comes and registers. So he was basically saying, if you're in the IOC business, we're going to put you out of business. One, do you agree with that statement? And two, are you starting to see people ask for those feeds to be integrated into your tip?
So I'll make a comment and I'll hand it off to Ryan, because Ryan is a unique subject matter expert in this area, given his background at General Dynamics, where he lived in this world, right? Intimate familiarity with it. The notion of sharing and the messaging, I think, has really, really good intentions that's coming out. Mm-hmm. But you then get into the devil's a little bit in the details when you start talking about classified data versus unclassified. Classified can't possibly be shared. So if you're sharing only unclassified, how much value is there? And I'm not critical of the intention of kind of those initiatives per se, but I am a little skeptical about the reality of will sharing in that way really, really occur. And if you look at commercial enterprises, there still is nervousness about sharing. So when you talk to them about the idea, for example, of the possibility of their information residing in a cloud, most of these folks will say, that's not my comfort zone, don't like that. So the inherent nature of the users of the products are, their intention is to try to keep as private as possible. So again, I don't criticize sharing, but we probably have a long road to go, in my opinion, to get there. And I'd like Ryan maybe to comment on the DHS and some of his experiences there.
I think ultimately it's definitely a step in the right direction. I mean, DHS is trying to kind of put a lot of people under an umbrella of kind of protection, if you will. But John's absolutely correct. The classified versus the unclassified is definitely an issue, as well as the adversaries that target the government typically are not the same adversaries targeting industry, which kind of leads to the ISACs being maybe a little bit more fruitful and a lot of that type of stuff. Is it going to put the providers out of business? Probably not. These commercial providers have, as John mentioned earlier, these operatives all over the globe, linguists in focusing on adversary dialects and penetrating the deep dark web where these adversaries are collaborating with each other. Whereas the government probably does have some capability and some knowledge in that, but they use it more for their kind of protecting national security and that type of stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how it transforms and how the industry really kind of takes to it. Did they embrace it and accept it? To that point, what's the volume that they're going to share? A lot of these customers or organizations are ultimately hamstringed by the number of detections they can put into their tools. If you hand somebody 1 million indicators, the chances they can make use of those 1 million indicators in a detection solution is very slim. So that's ultimately how does DHS provide that information? Do they categorize it by vertical? Do they categorize it by adversary? There's a couple different ways they can slice it.
So you mentioned ISACs, so I get to say ISO just because I like to say that. But so information sharing and analysis organizations, which seem to be much more loosely coupled, just anybody who wants to can set one up. And are you seeing any real activity there? And you would think the first thing, if I were to set up an ISO, the first thing I'd do is I'd get a tip and then start consuming stuff and spreading information amongst the members. Have you seen any activity yet? It's been almost a year. Coming
out of the defense industrial base, we were definitely part of an ISAC of sorts. And what we ultimately found is there's definitely sharing. The problem is a lot of the people that are doing a lot of that work, they share to an extent. But because they don't know the analyst on the other end of that sharing, it's hard for them to put a lot of that blood, sweat, and tears that they put into the discovery of the research and hand it to somebody who they don't know what they're going to do with that information. If a recipient unknowingly starts kind of probing that infrastructure, that adversary infrastructure, some of the adversaries basically kind of submerge and you don't know when they're going to pop their head back up again. So as much as sharing is very important, to some degree people aren't really doing it.
I find it to be a bit of a theoretical conversation, actually, and I'm reconfirming actually what Ryan just said. It sounds good, but the level of pain that the analysts are in today using their homegrown systems is sufficiently high that they just need to do the basics right now. They need to be able to ingest their information. They need to be able to normalize it. They need to be able to do searching on it. They need to be able to collaborate with their peers. Ideally, you'd like to be able to use this sort of platform to be able to level the skill set from a junior analyst to the most senior analyst. So all that's really, it's kind of basic blocking and tackling. My view is that sharing in a more pure way is probably somewhere down the road if we were to ever get there. So it sounds good in theory. When we talk to our customers, they don't put that as something that is first and foremost in their mind. They're talking to us about those other things. Right.
So what's down the road for ThreatQuotient over the next 6-12 months?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a couple of themes and I'll let Ryan weigh in. I think one of the areas which is probably going to be very intuitive, but it should be, it's this notion that the ability to make the system very extensible is an absolute high priority requirement for every customer. So I like to describe it that most of our customers have one of everything and they've got at least two of something that nobody's ever seen. They all are like that, right? And so we need to have the capabilities to have extremely robust, very easy to use API stacks that allow us to extend the platform, for them to extend it, for our partner to extend it. So the API area is one of the major areas that we're really, really focused on and improving that. Maybe I'll turn to Ryan and we can talk about some of the other things that we've got.
The UX and UI is becoming the unsung hero. Yeah. So screen monitors are only so big and the amount of data that threat intelligence is providing is vast. So what do analysts focus on? There's only, again, so much that they can put on the screen. So we're ultimately working with our customers kind of determine, as an analyst, whether you're a security analyst, an intelligence analyst, a hunter, what do you want to focus on? What do you want us to bubble up to the top? And it's very interesting because everybody has different answers. So it's how to allow the product to mold itself to an individual, to their discipline, versus the reverse. So there's a lot of focus on kind of the UX UI.
Would you have a philosophy of moving into the analytics and hunting arena?
Yes. I mean, the analytics, a lot of customers are, what should I focus on? What source of intelligence is my best source of intelligence? And ultimately looking at their tools and looking at the results of their sandbox or their honeypot and kind of crosswalking that with the threat intelligence to allow them to narrow the scope of what they're actually kind of pulling in.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. That was great.
Yeah, Richard, real pleasure to be here, and thank you for your time.
Very much appreciated.